What if the worst punishment wasn't the sentence handed down by a judge, but what happened after the cell door closed? Think about that for a second. Prison is supposed to be the end of the road, the final chapter, the place where chaos is contained, violence is controlled, and justice is sealed behind steel bars. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But what if that promise is a lie? Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a crime, it doesn't begin with an arrest, and it doesn't even begin with a verdict. It begins with a death inside a place designed to prevent exactly that. Multiple sharp force injuries, manner of death, homicide, location, a prison cell. And the man at the center of it all was already one of the most hated inmates in the system. So here's the question no one wants to answer out loud. How does a man under constant surveillance end up stabbed to death? Without anyone stopping it? Was it random violence? Was it revenge? Or was it something far more deliberate? Because according to whispers from inside the walls, this wasn't chaos. It was a message, short sentences, cold steel, and a silence that followed. You see, the public thought the story ended the day Nick Reiner was convicted. Headlines moved on. Outrage cooled. Comment sections went quiet. Justice, people said, had been served. But behind those walls, something else was unfolding. Something slower. Something darker. Something that doesn't show up in court transcripts or press conferences. And that's why this story matters now. Because what happened next didn't just raise questions about one inmate's death. It exposed cracks in a system that claims to control the uncontrollable. And it left behind a trail of unanswered questions that refuse to stay buried. Ask yourself this. If prison is meant to neutralize danger, how did danger thrive inside it? If justice was already delivered, why did someone feel the need to finish the job? And if no one saw it coming, why do so many insiders claim it was inevitable? Let's rewind. Not to the prison, not to the courtroom, but to the moment when the public still believed the nightmare was over. Because when Nick Reiner was sentenced, the narrative was simple, clean, almost comforting. The system worked. The suspect was caught. The victims were honored. And the future was sealed behind bars. For many, that was enough. But for others, especially those who live and work inside correctional facilities, that's where the real story usually begins. Prison isn't just a place. It's an ecosystem. A pressure cooker where grudges ferment, reputations mutate, and every detail about your past becomes currency. Who you are on the outside doesn't protect you inside. In some cases, it makes you a target. And Nick Reiner entered that world carrying something heavier than chains. He carried a name. A name associated with privilege. A name tied to notoriety. A name that other inmates believed symbolized everything they were denied. So let me ask you something. Do you think prison erases status? Or does it weaponize it? Because according to multiple accounts, from the moment he was processed, Nick wasn't just another inmate. He was watched, measured, judged, not by guards, by prisoners. And in that environment, judgment doesn't come with a gavel. It comes with consequences. The first weeks were quiet. Too quiet. No altercations. No reported threats. No disciplinary write-ups. To the outside world, that looked like adjustment. To seasoned inmates, it looked like something else entirely. Preparation. Here's a contradiction most people don't understand. Violence in prison rarely explodes without warning. It simmers. It moves through glances, whispers, alliances. It hides behind routine until the moment it doesn't. And Nick, whether he knew it or not, was standing at the center of an invisible storm. Some inmates reportedly avoided him. Others lingered too long when he passed. And a few, according to later claims, asked questions that had nothing to do with the present and everything to do with the past. Questions about the crime. Questions about the victims. Questions about whether he felt remorse. Think about how dangerous that is. In a place where respect is survival, the wrong answer can cost you everything. And silence. Silence can be interpreted as arrogance, or guilt, or defiance. So when people say, "How could this happen without warning?" they're usually asking the wrong question. The better question is this: who was watching closely enough to see the warning signs, and who chose to ignore them? Because here's what we know. The day Nick Reiner died was not chaotic. It was not a riot. It was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence. It was a Sunday. Routine counts. Predictable movement. A schedule everyone inside had memorized. And somehow, during that ordinary window of time, something extraordinary happened. A man was attacked, repeatedly, with a sharp object, inside a secured environment. And when he was found, it was already too late. No alarms, no immediate intervention, no clear explanation, just a body, and a report, multiple sharp force injuries. Homicide. Those words are clinical, cold. They don't capture the reality of what it means for a system designed to monitor every breath to miss an act like this. So let me ask you directly, do you believe this was a failure or a decision? Because insiders have quietly debated that question ever since. Some say understaffing, some say blind spots, some say bad luck. Others say something much more uncomfortable. They say Nick Reiner was living on borrowed time the moment he arrived. They say the system didn't create the violence, it allowed it. And that's where this story stops being about one man and starts being about something much bigger. About what happens when justice becomes complicated, when punishment extends beyond the sentence, when accountability disappears into paperwork and silence. As we move forward, we're going to break this story down piece by piece. The arrest that sealed his fate, the prison environment that reshaped him, the people who may have wanted him dead, and the moments that led to the final, irreversible outcome. But before we go there, remember this. Every prison death has two stories. The official one, and the one whispered between locked doors. And in Nick Reiner's case, those two stories don't match. Because according to people who were there, what happened next wasn't sudden. It was inevitable. And the signs were there long before the blade ever touched skin. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Maintain the dramatic exposé tone. What if the moment that decides your fate isn't the crime, but the night the cell door closes behind you? Because that's when the rules change. That's when the world you knew dissolves into concrete, steel, and silence. And that's when Nick Reiner stopped being a headline and became a body waiting for a number. The transfer van didn't look dramatic. No flashing lights, no shouting crowds, no cinematic tension, just metal doors, humming tires, and the low mechanical sound of a system doing what it does best, processing people like cargo. Nick sat alone, hands cuffed, ankles chained, head forward, not defiant, not emotional, just still, the kind of stillness that isn't calm, but contained. Inside that van, nobody talked to him. Guards didn't joke. No one asked questions. No one explained what came next. And that silence? That was the first warning. Because inside the prison system, silence is never neutral. It's either protection or preparation. Ask yourself this. Why would trained officers, used to volatile inmates, treat one man like he was already radioactive? Some would later say it was protocol. Others would quietly admit it was caution. Because Nick didn't arrive like everyone else. He arrived with a reputation. By the time he stepped through intake, inmates already knew his name. Guards already knew his case. Administrators already knew the liability attached to him. That's the thing people don't understand. Prison isn't cut off from the outside world. News travels faster inside than it does on social media. By the time Nick's fingerprints were taken, his story had already been traded for favors, leverage, and curiosity. And curiosity in prison is dangerous. The first strip search was routine. The uniform was standard. The number assigned to him erased the last visible piece of who he used to be. But not the name. That followed him, down the hall, into the holding cell, through the echoing corridors where every footstep felt louder than it should. Nick was placed in temporary housing first. Standard procedure, observation, evaluation, risk assessment. On paper, it was about safety. In reality, it was about something else. Visibility. Because in those first hours, everyone was watching. Other inmates leaned back on benches pretending not to stare. Guards pretended not to notice. Cameras pretended to see everything. And Nick pretended not to feel it. That's the contradiction. Prison demands you show nothing while exposing you to everything. No emotion, no weakness, no fear. But fear doesn't disappear just because you don't show it. It waits. The first night passed without incident. No threats, no confrontation, no violence. If you're thinking that means things were fine, you don't understand prison. Because the most dangerous phase isn't when fists fly. It's when people decide, and decisions were being made. By morning, Nick had already been categorized. Not officially, not on paper, but in the way inmates look at you longer than necessary. In the way conversations stop when you approach. in the way guards linger just a second too long before locking your door. He wasn't just another inmate. He was a symbol. To some, he represented privilege finally stripped away. To others, he represented unforgivable crimes. And to a few, he represented opportunity. Because prison justice doesn't care about court rulings. It operates on a different logic. A logic where punishment doesn't end when the sentence begins. Nick learned that quickly. During his second day, an inmate approached him in the common area. No aggression. No insults. Just a question. Do you feel sorry? Think about how impossible that question is. Answer yes, and you invite weakness. Answer no, and you invite rage. Say nothing, and you invite interpretation. Nick didn't answer. He stood up and walked away. And that moment, that's when things shifted. Because in prison, walking away doesn't always de-escalate. Sometimes, it confirms what people already believe. That night, a guard noted something unusual. Nick didn't sleep. He lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling. Eyes open, jaw tight. Was it guilt, fear, or instinct? Because here's something unsettling. Some inmates can sense when danger is approaching. Not logically, viscerally. And Nick's body was reacting before his mind caught up. By day 3, whispers followed him. Nothing direct. Nothing reportable. Just fragments. Someone saying his name too softly. Someone laughing without a joke. Someone brushing past him just a little too close. These are the early warning signs. The ones that never make it into incident reports. And if you're asking yourself why no one intervened, here's the uncomfortable truth. Intervening requires certainty, and prison runs on plausible deniability. By the end of the week, Nick was moved to a more permanent unit. That decision would later become controversial. Some said it was routine progression. Others said it was reckless. Because the unit he was moved into wasn't violent on paper, but it was socially volatile. Strong personalities, unspoken hierarchies, long memories. And most importantly, inmates with nothing to lose. Nick entered that unit as an outsider with baggage. The worst possible combination. The first confrontation wasn't physical. It was verbal. A comment shouted from across the tier. A reminder of his past. A provocation disguised as conversation. Guards heard it. They logged it. But they didn't act. Why? Because words aren't violence. Until they are. And here's where the timeline starts to matter. Because less than 48 hours after that verbal exchange, Nick was reassigned again. A lateral move. Same security level. Different cell block. On paper, it looked like flexibility. In reality, it looked like instability. Every move resets alliances. Every move creates exposure. And every move gives people time to plan. That's when the first unofficial warning surfaced. An inmate, someone who had survived long enough to recognize patterns, allegedly told Nick to keep his head down. To stop walking alone. To stop sitting near the rail. To stop thinking he was invisible. Nick reportedly nodded, but he didn't change his routine. Maybe he didn't believe it. Maybe he didn't want to appear afraid. Or maybe he assumed the system would protect him. That assumption is deadly. Because prisons don't protect individuals. They manage risk. And sometimes, that means letting situations resolve themselves. The Sunday it happened began like every other. Count. Chow. Movement. No lockdowns. No alerts. Just routine. And routine is the most dangerous disguise of all. Nick was last seen alive mid-afternoon, walking back toward his cell. Alone. Think about that. In a place where everyone watches everything, no one noticed what came next. No shouts. No alarm. No immediate response. By the time guards reached him, the outcome was already sealed. Multiple sharp force injuries. Those words don't describe chaos. They describe intent. And intent doesn't form in seconds. It forms over days. Weeks. Sometimes longer. Which brings us back to the question we started with. How does something like this happen without warning? The answer is, it didn't. The warnings were there. They were just easy to ignore. Because acknowledging them would mean admitting the system isn't as controlled as it claims. And that's where this story gets even darker. Because when investigators began reviewing the events leading up to Nick's death, they noticed something strange. A gap. Not in footage. Not in logs. But in accountability. People remembered details differently. Timelines didn't quite align. And one key interaction wasn't documented at all. Someone had spoken to Nick shortly before his death. Someone whose name didn't appear in any report. And when asked about it later, staff gave conflicting answers. Some said it never happened. Others said they couldn't remember, and a few refused to answer entirely. That's when speculation turned into suspicion. Because memory doesn't usually fail this completely unless there's something to forget. As we move into the next chapter, we're going to examine what happened in the hours leading up to that moment, who Nick interacted with, who was nearby, and which systems quietly failed or stepped aside. Because the more closely you look at that Sunday, the clearer one thing becomes. Nick Reiner didn't die in a moment of chaos. He died at the end of a process. And the most disturbing part? Somewhere along the line, someone decided not to stop it. But what happened next would raise even more questions and point toward a figure no one expected. Here's the uncomfortable question no one asks out loud. What happens when a man who once lived surrounded by comfort, recognition, and protection suddenly finds himself in a place where none of that matters? Because prison doesn't care who you were. It only cares who you are when the door locks. And for Nick Reiner, that transition wasn't gradual. It was violent in its own quiet way. The morning after his reassignment, the cell door slid open with a sound that didn't echo, it absorbed. Concrete has a way of swallowing noise, of making everything feel smaller, tighter, closer. Nick stepped out into a new tier. Different faces, different energy, different rules that no one ever explains out loud. If the first unit had been tense, this one was calculating. The kind of place where people don't react impulsively. They observe. They wait. They remember. And Nick didn't belong there. Not because he was better. Not because he was worse. But because he didn't understand the currency. In prison, currency isn't money. It's reputation. It's alliances. It's knowing when to speak and when to disappear. Nick had none of that. He had a name everyone recognized and a past everyone judged. And that combination is radioactive behind bars. Here's the contradiction that defines incarceration. The system strips you of individuality, but the inmates never do. They notice everything. The way you walk, the way you hold your shoulders, the way you look at the floor instead of meeting someone's eyes. And Nick walked like someone who wasn't used to being challenged. Not arrogant, just unfamiliar with danger that doesn't announce itself. That's how one inmate later described it. He moved like the world would still stop if he needed it to. It wouldn't. By mid-morning, the first unspoken test arrived. A seat in the common area. It sounds trivial, but it isn't. Where you sit determines who notices you, who claims you, who resents you. Nick chose an empty bench near the wall. A neutral choice. Or at least, it would have been in any other world. But in this unit, empty didn't mean available. It meant avoided. And avoidance in prison is never accidental. Conversations shifted. Eyes tracked him. No one challenged him directly, but no one welcomed him either. That's the space where danger grows. Not in confrontation, but in isolation. You see, prisons run on social gravity. Everyone orbits something. A group, a reputation, a history. Nick orbited nothing, and that made him unpredictable. Some inmates reportedly saw him as untouchable. Others saw him as unprotected. Both interpretations are dangerous, because when people believe someone is protected, they test the boundaries. And when they believe someone isn't, they test them. Nick's first meal in the new unit was eaten in silence. Not forced silence. Chosen silence. He sat, ate, left. No exchanges. No comments. No conflict. On the surface, it looked like compliance. Underneath, it looked like a mistake. Because refusing to engage doesn't make you invisible. It makes you suspicious. What's he hiding? What does he think he's above? Why isn't he reacting like the rest of us? Questions like that don't stay theoretical for long. By the second day, someone spoke to him again. Different inmate. Same tone. Casual. Almost friendly. Do you know where you are? It wasn't an insult. It was a warning disguised as curiosity. Nick reportedly answered calmly. Said he did. But the way the question was asked mattered more than the answer. Because in prison, questions aren't asked for information. They're asked to see how you respond under pressure. That inmate walked away smiling. And smiles in prison rarely mean goodwill. From that point on, Nick's movements were noticed more closely. How long he stayed in the shower. Which route he took back to his cell. Whether he spoke to guards longer than necessary. Everything becomes data. And data becomes leverage. Here's something most people don't realize. Prisons are not static environments. They're constantly renegotiating power. Every day, every hour, every interaction either reinforces your position or erodes it. Nick's position was eroding fast. Not because he provoked anyone, but because he didn't. Because by then, being alone felt safer than being seen. And for a while it was. Until it wasn't. What happened later that day didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of patterns ignored, signals dismissed, and a system that mistook silence for stability. As we move forward, we need to look closely at that final stretch of hours. The moments when prevention was still possible, the choices that were made, and the ones that weren't. Because the closer you get to the truth, the clearer one thing becomes. Nick Reiner wasn't just failed by other inmates. He was failed by a structure that depends on warning signs, while quietly training itself not to see them. And the most chilling part? There was one specific moment that Sunday when everything could have changed. A moment recorded, a moment witnessed, a moment that never made it into the official timeline. But what happened in that moment would only come to light much later. And it points directly to someone who was never supposed to be involved at all. What if the most dangerous enemy isn't the one who threatens you, but the one who never looks at you twice? Because prison violence doesn't usually announce itself with raised voices or clenched fists. It announces itself with patience. By Sunday afternoon, the unit looked ordinary. That's what made it terrifying. Men moved through routine like clockwork. Cards slapped against metal tables. Footsteps echoed in predictable rhythms. Guards walked their paths with practiced indifference. And Nick Reiner blended into the background just enough to feel safe. That's the lie routine tells you. That if nothing looks wrong, nothing is wrong. But beneath the surface, alliances had shifted. Not loudly, not obviously, quietly. Because enemies in prison don't always hate you. Sometimes, they simply decide you're expendable. Nick didn't realize it yet, but by the time Sunday arrived, he wasn't being watched anymore. He was being timed. Here's a reality most people don't understand. In prison, enemies don't always form because of personal conflict. Sometimes they form because of symbolism. Nick symbolized something powerful. To some inmates, he represented a system that had failed them. To others, he represented attention they would never receive. And to a few, he represented leverage. Because hurting someone like Nick didn't just send a message inside the unit. It echoed outside. And that echo mattered. The first sign that something had shifted came from an unlikely place. A guard. During midday movement, one officer slowed near Nick's cell. Just long enough to look inside. Not long enough to say anything. That pause wasn't concern. It was calculation. Guards don't pause unless they sense instability. And instability doesn't always mean violence. Sometimes it means anticipation. Nick noticed it. You could tell by the way his shoulders tightened. He wasn't paranoid. He was perceptive. But perception doesn't equal protection. As afternoon recreation began, Nick did something he hadn't done in days. He sat closer to other inmates. Not to socialize. To be visible. That choice alone tells you something had changed inside him. Because earlier in the week, he avoided crowds. Now he was testing proximity. Testing safety in numbers. And that tells us something else too. Someone had made him uncomfortable enough to change his behavior. The problem? He changed it too late. Across the yard, a group laughed. Not loudly. Not obnoxiously. But consistently. Laughter in prison is rarely spontaneous. It's often a signal. And that laughter wasn't about a joke. It was about timing. Nick didn't look at them. That was another mistake. Avoiding eye contact can be interpreted as respect or disrespect. It depends entirely on who's watching. And someone was watching very closely. You see, enemies in prison rarely act alone. They act within an ecosystem. Someone observes. Someone tests. Someone executes. And everyone else pretends not to see. Because seeing creates obligation. And obligation is dangerous. Nick finished recreation early. He stood up, nodded at no one, and headed back toward the unit. Alone. Again. If you're wondering why no one walked with him, here's the hard truth. By then, distance had become self-preservation. People sensed the shift. They didn't want to be nearby when something happened. Because proximity can make you a witness. And witnesses are liabilities. Nick walked the corridor at a normal pace. Not rushed. Not hesitant. But his body language betrayed him. His hands clenched and unclenched. His jaw tightened. He was listening for footsteps behind him. That's instinct. And instinct doesn't activate without reason. Halfway down the corridor, he slowed. Just slightly. That moment mattered. Because it created a gap. A gap in movement. A gap in visibility. A gap in protection. Behind him, Someone else adjusted their pace too. Not to catch up, to align. And alignment is everything. Here's where the timeline fractures. According to official logs, nothing unusual happened during that stretch of time. No incident reports, no alarms, no deviations from schedule. But according to later whispers, that corridor wasn't empty. It was occupied by opportunity. Nick reached the turn toward his cell block. That corner was notorious, not because it was violent, because it was blind. Cameras covered entrances and exits. But the turn itself? Just a momentary gap. Seconds. But seconds are enough. Nick stepped into that blind spot. And that's when the atmosphere changed. Not dramatically, subtly. The kind of change you feel in your chest before your brain catches up. A shift in air. A presence behind you. He turned. Not fast enough. What happened next wasn't a frenzy. It wasn't chaotic. It was controlled. Calculated. Multiple actions. Close range. Intentional. No shouting. No prolonged struggle. That's important. Because chaos draws attention. Precision avoids it. Nick fell. Not immediately. That matters too. Because it means he was aware. Aware enough to understand something irreversible was happening. By the time anyone reached him, the corridor had returned to normal. Footsteps resumed. Voices echoed. Routine reasserted itself. That's how prison violence survives. By blending back into the ordinary. Guards found Nick minutes later. Not seconds. Minutes. And in that delay, the outcome was sealed. They called for medical assistance. They followed protocol. They did everything the report requires. But protocols don't rewind time. Nick was pronounced dead shortly after. Multiple sharp force injuries. Homicide. Official. Clinical. Final. But here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because while the death itself was recorded, the context wasn't. Who was nearby? Who changed routes? Who avoided the corridor? Those details didn't make it into the official narrative. And yet, multiple inmates later claimed they knew exactly when it would happen. Think about that. How can people anticipate violence without being involved? Because anticipation doesn't require participation. It requires awareness. And awareness means the signs were obvious to those who knew how to read them. Nick's enemies weren't loud. They didn't threaten him publicly. They didn't posture. They waited. They allowed the system to do most of the work. And then they exploited the gaps. That's the contradiction that haunts this case. The prison didn't collapse into chaos. It functioned exactly as designed. And that design includes blind spots. As news of Nick's death spread through the unit, reactions were muted. No shock. No disbelief. Just confirmation. That alone should trouble you. Because when violence surprises no one, it means it was expected. And expectation implies inevitability. Within hours, rumors started circulating. Different versions. Different suspects. Different motives. Some said revenge. Others said silence. A few whispered something even darker. They said Nick wasn't the target. He was the solution. A way to close a chapter that made too many people uncomfortable. Because as long as Nick was alive, questions lingered. Appeals. Interviews. Potential revelations. Death eliminates all of that. That's not justice. That's convenience. And here's the detail that refuses to go away. The weapon was never recovered. Not during the immediate search. Not during later sweeps. Not ever. Which means one of two things. Either the attacker was extraordinarily lucky, or someone helped make it disappear. As investigations unfolded, focus shifted quickly. Not to motive, not to planning, but to procedure. Did guards follow protocol? Were cameras functioning? Were counts accurate? Those questions matter. But they also distract. Because they frame the death as a failure, not an outcome. And outcomes don't require blame. Failures do. One guard, according to internal chatter, asked an uncomfortable question during debrief. Why was Nick alone? That question didn't receive a direct answer. Instead, it was reframed. He chose to walk alone, as if choice exists in a system designed to limit it, as if vulnerability is voluntary, as if isolation isn't sometimes imposed by fear. That reframing did something important. It shifted responsibility from environment to individual. And once responsibility shifts, accountability dissolves. By the next day, the unit had returned to normal. Cells cleaned. Schedules resumed. Nick's name removed from the roster. That's another harsh truth. Prison doesn't pause for death. It absorbs it. And in doing so, it erases urgency. But not everyone moved on. One inmate reportedly requested protective custody the following week. No explanation, just a request. Another inmate asked for a transfer. Again, no reason given. Patterns, movement, aftershocks. These are the things investigators should notice. But they didn't, or they chose not to. As external authorities reviewed the case, something else emerged. A discrepancy, a small one. A missing timestamp, a window of time that didn't align with staff recollections. Nothing dramatic, just enough to raise a question. And questions are dangerous, because they invite scrutiny. And scrutiny reveals things systems prefer to keep buried. As we move into the next chapter, we're going to focus on that discrepancy, the surveillance gap, the 7 minutes no one wants to talk about. Because in those 7 minutes, the difference between failure and facilitation becomes impossible to ignore. And what happened during that window points to a breakdown that goes far beyond one inmate and straight into the heart of institutional control. But what came next would change everything and expose a silence that was never supposed to be heard. What if the most important warning wasn't shouted, but whispered? Because in places like this, warnings don't arrive with sirens. They arrive sideways, half-spoken, easy to dismiss. And when they're ignored, they don't disappear. They come back as consequences. By the time Nick Reiner's body was removed from the corridor, the story had already begun to harden. Reports were drafted. Language was chosen carefully. Events were framed in the calm, distant tone institutions prefer. A death had occurred. An investigation would follow. Procedures were observed. Case closed. But inside the walls, no one believed that. Because too many people remembered things they weren't supposed to remember. Too many details didn't line up. And too many warnings had been floating through the air in the days before his death. Warnings that now felt impossible to ignore. Here's the first one. 2 days before Sunday, a guard had noticed something off during evening count. Nick hadn't responded immediately when his name was called. Not because he was asleep. Not because he was distracted. Because he hesitated. That hesitation was logged as nothing. A moment. A pause. But in prison, hesitation matters. It signals indecision, fear, or anticipation. When the guard later asked if everything was fine, Nick reportedly nodded and said yes. And that was the end of it. No follow-up. No notation. Why? Because inmates say yes all the time when things are not fine. And guards learn to accept it. Here's the contradiction that defines institutional failure. Systems train people to rely on explicit reports. In environments where explicit reporting can get you hurt. Nick didn't ask for help, but he did something else. Something quieter. The following morning, he altered his routine again. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. He left his cell later than usual. He stayed closer to walls. He avoided certain sightlines. To someone trained to read behavior, those changes scream unease. To a system trained to process checklists, they're invisible. That same day, another inmate allegedly approached a staff member with a vague comment. Nothing actionable, nothing specific, just a suggestion that tensions were rising. That comment was acknowledged, not acted on. Why? Because tension is constant in prison. If you treat every hint as a crisis, the system collapses. So instead, hints are normalized, filed under background noise. The warning that mattered most, though, came hours before Nick died. And this one is harder to dismiss. According to later accounts, Nick briefly spoke to a staff member during midday movement. It wasn't a formal conversation. No report was filed. No supervisor was notified. Just a few words exchanged in passing. Words that, at the time, didn't seem urgent. But now, they haunt the timeline. He asked about cell movement, not requesting a transfer, not asking for protection, just asking if schedules ever change. That's an odd question. Because inmates rarely care about schedules unless they're trying to avoid something. Or someone. The staff member reportedly answered casually. Schedules are schedules. And that was it. No follow-up. No escalation. Because again, nothing explicit was said. But here's the uncomfortable truth. People rarely articulate fear clearly when fear itself is dangerous. They probe. They test. They hint. And if the response doesn't open a door, they retreat. Nick retreated. He didn't ask again. He didn't push. He didn't make himself a problem. And in doing so, he disappeared into the routine. That's how the system prefers it. Problems that don't announce themselves. But silence is not safety. It's just quiet danger. By early afternoon, the unit settled into that eerie calm that follows tension. Everyone felt it. No one named it. You could see it in body language. Inmates clustering differently, movement slowing, eyes tracking exits instead of conversations. A seasoned guard later described it like this. It felt like the air was holding its breath. That feeling alone should have triggered something. But feelings don't trigger protocols. Only incidents do. And the incident hadn't happened yet. So the system kept moving. Here's where the timeline narrows. Because everything that followed happened within a window so small, it almost vanished in paperwork. The surveillance gap. Officially, cameras were functioning. No outages. No malfunctions. That's what the report says. But reports don't capture everything. Because cameras don't see intention. They don't interpret context. And they don't always record continuously. Between scheduled checks, between angles, between blind spots, there are moments. And those moments matter. Nick's last confirmed sighting on camera placed him entering the corridor that led to his cell block. Timestamp logged. Routine. But the next timestamp? That's where things get strange. Because there's a gap. Not a blackout. Not a dramatic failure. Just missing continuity. 7 minutes. 7 minutes where footage jumps forward. No visual record of the corridor itself. No clear explanation. In technical terms, it's nothing. In investigative terms, it's everything. Because 7 minutes is an eternity when something goes wrong. Within that window, Nick moved through a space that cameras didn't fully cover. A known limitation. A design flaw that had been noted before. And that's important. Because blind spots don't become dangerous on their own. They become dangerous when people know they exist. And people did. Inmates know where cameras don't reach. Staff know too. That knowledge circulates. Quietly. Efficiently. Nick entered that space unaware of how exposed it made him. Or maybe he knew. Maybe that's why his pace changed. Maybe that's why witnesses later described him as tense. But tension doesn't equal escape. It just means you know something bad is close. What happened in those 7 minutes has never been reconstructed conclusively. There were no direct witnesses willing to speak. No clear footage. No audio. Just aftermath. And aftermath tells a different story than violence itself. Because aftermath shows you who reacts and who doesn't. When Nick was found, the response was controlled. Professional. Almost detached. Medical protocols initiated. Area secured. Supervisors notified. All correct. All by the book. But some guards noticed something odd. No one seemed surprised. Concerned, yes. Urgent, yes. But not shocked. And that lack of shock matters. Because shock implies the unexpected. And this felt expected. Within hours, preliminary explanations circulated. Unprovoked attack. Unknown assailant. Ongoing investigation. Standard language. Safe language. Language that closes doors instead of opening them. But among inmates, a different narrative spread. They spoke of warnings. Of signals. Of a sense that this was always how it would end. One inmate reportedly said something chilling to a guard that evening. Everyone knew it was coming. That comment didn't make it into any report. It wasn't actionable. It wasn't specific. But it should have raised alarms. Because when everyone knows, ignorance stops being an excuse. As investigators began reviewing staff statements, discrepancies emerged. Not major ones. Nothing that screams conspiracy. Just small inconsistencies. Who saw Nick last? When counts were conducted? Who was in which corridor? Memory gaps. Conflicting recollections. The kind that happen when people are protecting themselves. Or protecting something else. One staff member's timeline placed Nick in the corridor earlier than another's. A difference of minutes. Minutes that happened to fall inside the 7-minute gap. Another staff member claimed to have seen nothing unusual. Despite being positioned close enough to hear disturbances under normal circumstances. But there were no reports of noise. No shouts. No struggle. Which suggests control. And control suggests planning. Here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. Random violence is loud. It spills. It draws attention. This didn't. This was quiet. Efficient. Contained. That's not typical inmate behavior without coordination. And coordination requires either time or tolerance. Maybe both. As days passed, the official investigation narrowed. Focus shifted toward internal compliance. Were procedures followed? Were counts accurate? Were staffing levels sufficient? Those questions are safe. They don't accuse. They don't threaten. But they also don't ask the hardest question. Why wasn't Nick protected after the warnings surfaced? Because acknowledging warnings means acknowledging choice. And choice means responsibility. The warning that came too late wasn't a single moment. It was a chain. A hesitation during count. A change in routine. Triggered paperwork. Raised questions. And questions create scrutiny. Sometimes systems choose the path of least resistance, even when that path leads somewhere irreversible. As the days turned into weeks, one detail refused to settle. A staff member, the same one Nick had spoken to hours before his death, submitted a revised statement. Minor clarification, minor wording change. But revisions after the fact always raise suspicion. Because memory usually fades, it doesn't sharpen. When asked why the statement was revised, the answer was simple. Wanted to be precise. Precision after tragedy often masks uncertainty, or regret, or both. As external oversight loomed, attention turned to surveillance. The 7-minute gap became harder to explain away. Technical reviews were conducted, explanations offered, but none addressed the core issue. Why was a known blind spot left unmonitored during peak movement? Why weren't patrols adjusted? Why wasn't Nick accompanied? Those questions lingered. And lingering questions make institutions nervous because they suggest something more than failure. They suggest avoidance. As we move into the next chapter, we're going to focus entirely on that surveillance window, what the cameras should have captured, what they didn't, and why that absence may be the loudest evidence of all. Because sometimes, what isn't recorded tells you more than what is. And what happened in those missing minutes would eventually point toward a figure no one wanted to look at too closely. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's the question that refuses to go away. How does a man die in a building full of cameras without a single clear image explaining how? 7 minutes. That's the number that keeps resurfacing. Not shouted, not highlighted, just sitting there in the timeline like a loose thread no one wants to pull. Because 7 minutes is long enough for an argument, long enough for a decision, long enough for someone to act and disappear back into routine. And in Nick Reiner's case, 7 minutes is all it took. Officially, the cameras were working. That point was repeated again and again in early briefings. No outage, no malfunction, no tampering. Everything was operational, which makes what happened next even harder to accept. Because when investigators reviewed the footage, they noticed something subtle. Not a blackout, not static. A jump, a clean, seamless jump forward in time. One moment Nick is seen entering the corridor. The next moment, guards are responding to an emergency call. No footage of the corridor itself. No continuous tracking. No visual record of the most critical stretch. 7 minutes unaccounted for. Let that sink in. In a system designed to record everything, the most important moment simply isn't there. And the explanation? Angle limitations. That's what they said. Camera placement didn't fully cover that section. A known blind spot, documented in previous assessments. Which raises the next question. If the blind spot was known, why wasn't it addressed? Here's where institutional logic kicks in. Fixing blind spots costs money. Money requires approval. Approval requires justification. And until something goes wrong, blind spots are theoretical risks. After something goes wrong, they become liabilities. But by then, it's too late. The corridor where Nick was attacked wasn't hidden. It was functional, used daily, passed through dozens of times. That normalcy is what made it dangerous. Because familiarity breeds complacency. Staff knew the cameras didn't cover every inch. Inmates knew too. That knowledge circulates. It always does. Someone points it out once. Someone else confirms it. And soon, everyone understands where eyes don't reach. That doesn't mean violence happens immediately. It means opportunity exists. And opportunity waits for timing. 7 minutes. Within that window, multiple things happened that will never be fully reconstructed. Nick walked the corridor. Someone else entered it. Someone else left. And no camera tells us who. That absence forced investigators to rely on secondary data. Movement logs, count sheets, radio chatter. None of those capture intent. None of them capture proximity. And none of them capture what matters most. Who was there, and who wasn't supposed to be. Staff timelines became critical. But they didn't align perfectly. One guard placed Nick entering the corridor slightly earlier than the camera timestamp suggested. Another believed he passed the corridor later. Small discrepancies. But small discrepancies add up. Because they all cluster around the same 7-minute window. When asked directly about the blind spot, administrators gave careful answers. It's under review. Enhancements are being considered. Protocols were followed. Safe language. Language that deflects rather than explains. But here's the thing. Blind spots don't kill people. What kills people is what happens when blind spots meet predictability. Nick's routine was predictable by then. When he moved, which route he took, when he was alone. Predictability is dangerous in prison. It turns people into targets. And targets don't need chaos. They need timing. The footage before the gap shows nothing unusual. Nick walking. No one immediately behind him. No confrontation. That's what makes the next part so disturbing. Because when guards arrived, there was no sign of a struggle spilling into other areas. No overturned carts. No shouting heard by nearby units. No inmates running. Everything suggests the incident was contained within that blind spot. Contained enough not to alert anyone. That alone narrows possibilities. Random violence rarely stays contained. Fear causes noise. Noise draws attention. This did not. Which suggests whoever attacked Nick knew exactly where they were. And exactly how much time they had. 7 minutes. Plenty. Another detail complicates things further. According to internal maintenance records, the camera angle covering the corridor entrance had been adjusted weeks earlier. A minor adjustment. Barely worth noting. But adjustments change coverage. And coverage changes opportunity. Was the adjustment related? Officially, no. It was routine. But routine explanations don't erase coincidence. Especially when that adjustment widened the blind spot just enough to matter. Investigators asked the obvious questions. Who authorized the adjustment? Why was it made? Was it reviewed? Answers were provided. Names were cited. Paperwork was produced. Everything looked legitimate. Which is exactly why suspicion lingered. Because when systems fail accidentally, things look messy. This didn't. It looked clean. Too clean. As days passed, attention shifted from cameras to people. Who was assigned where? Who was on duty? Who had line of sight? Those questions created tension. Because suddenly, staff weren't just observers. They were variables. Most cooperated fully. A few were defensive. And one became noticeably uncomfortable. This guard's name surfaced repeatedly in timeline reconstructions. Not because they were present during the attack, but because they were nearby just before it. Close enough to notice changes. Close enough to intervene. Close enough to hear something if it happened loudly. But they reported hearing nothing. Not a sound. That's possible. Concrete absorbs noise. Distance matters. But it's also convenient. Especially when paired with another detail. That same guard's patrol pattern deviated slightly that afternoon. Not dramatically. Just enough to leave the corridor unattended a bit longer than usual. Was it intentional? There's no proof. But intention isn't always provable. Sometimes it's inferred. And inference is dangerous territory for institutions. Because it opens the door to questions they can't answer cleanly. Here's where the story takes a darker turn. During internal review, an analyst noticed something odd about radio traffic. A brief lull. Not silence. Just fewer transmissions than expected during that 7-minute window. No emergency calls. No check-ins. Nothing unusual on paper. But unusual in context. Because busy units don't go quiet without reason. When asked about it, staff attributed it to routine overlap. People assuming someone else was checking in. Assumptions again. Always assumptions. But assumptions are how systems fail. 7 minutes. That's the length of time it took for Nick's fate to be sealed. But it's also the length of time it took for accountability to blur. Because once that window closed, clarity was gone. After Nick's death, the blind spot was addressed quickly. Cameras adjusted. Coverage expanded. Policies updated. That speed raised eyebrows. Fixes that take years to approve suddenly happen overnight when there's a body involved. Which leads to another uncomfortable question. If the fix was that easy, why wasn't it done before? The answer is always the same. Nothing forced it. Until something did. But fixing the blind spot after the fact doesn't explain what happened within it. It just ensures it won't happen again. Or at least, not the same way. Inmates noticed the changes immediately. They always do. New angles. New patrols. New rules. And with those changes came whispers. Not about the attack. About the aftermath. About who was suddenly nervous. About who was suddenly quiet. Because when surveillance increases, people start worrying about what else might be seen. One inmate reportedly said something chilling during a private conversation. They knew exactly when to do it. That statement didn't specify who or how, but it confirmed what many suspected. Timing wasn't accidental. Timing was chosen. And chosen timing implies foreknowledge. Foreknowledge of blind spots. Foreknowledge of patrol gaps. Foreknowledge of response times. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from proximity, from observation, from experience, or from information. And information moves through prisons like currency. Which brings us to the most disturbing possibility of all. What if the blind spot wasn't just known, but trusted? Trusted enough that someone felt safe acting within it. Trusted enough that they believed no one would intervene. Trusted enough that 7 minutes was more than enough. That level of confidence doesn't come from desperation. It comes from certainty. As oversight bodies continued to review the case, the 7-minute gap became a focal point. Externally, it was framed as an unfortunate limitation. Internally, it was treated like a problem best contained. Contained within reports. Contained within language. Contained within procedural explanations. But containment doesn't erase doubt. It concentrates it. Because every time someone tried to move past the gap, it pulled them back. Why there? Why then? Why alone? Those questions don't fade. They sharpen. And eventually, they point somewhere. Someone. As we move into the next chapter, we're going to follow where those questions lead. To a person whose role in this story was supposed to be minor, routine, forgettable, but whose proximity to the blind spot, and to Nick, becomes impossible to ignore once you line everything up. Because sometimes, the most important figure in a tragedy isn't the one who acts. It's the one who stands close enough to stop it, and doesn't. And when you look closely at who had that opportunity, one name keeps resurfacing. But what happened next would challenge everything investigators thought they understood, and force a confrontation no one was prepared for. Here's the question that should have stopped everything. How does a murder weapon disappear inside a locked environment? Because prisons are designed to control objects. Count them, track them, confiscate them. Yet in Nick Reiner's case, the one object that mattered most was never found. Not immediately, not later, not ever. And that absence changed everything. When investigators first entered the corridor, their focus was clinical. Secure the area, document the scene, preserve evidence. They followed protocol. They always do. But protocol assumes evidence wants to be found. This time, it didn't. The corridor was cleared. Cells were searched. Common areas were swept. Nothing. No blade. No improvised tool. No discarded object. Just the aftermath. And that alone narrowed the possibilities. Because in prison, weapons don't usually disappear by accident. They're hidden, passed, or removed. Each option requires intention. Let's talk about the environment. This wasn't a workshop. This wasn't a kitchen detail. Access to sharp objects was limited, highly limited. Every approved tool was logged. Every movement tracked. Which means whatever was used didn't come from an authorized source. Or if it did, records would have shown it. They didn't. So investigators pivoted. If the weapon wasn't authorized, it was improvised. That's common enough. Inmates fashion weapons from everyday materials. But here's the contradiction. Improvised weapons are hard to hide. They're bulky, crude, recognizable. They leave traces. And this one left nothing. No fragments. No remnants. No telltale materials. That raised eyebrows. Because making something sharp enough to cause fatal injuries, and then completely removing it, isn't easy. Especially under pressure. Especially within minutes. Especially without being seen. Which leads to the next uncomfortable possibility. What if the weapon wasn't improvised on the spot? What if it was introduced? That idea alone makes institutions nervous. Because introduction implies breach. A failure of screening. Or worse, assistance. Investigators reviewed intake logs. Nothing missing. Tool inventories. All accounted for. Maintenance records. No discrepancies. Everything looked clean. Again, too clean. Here's where context matters. In prison, contraband doesn't move randomly. It moves through channels. Trusted channels. Channels that rely on predictability and silence. Someone brings something in. Someone stores it. Someone uses it. Someone disposes of it. Each step requires trust. And trust doesn't form overnight. Nick had been inside long enough for relationships to solidify, but not long enough to build trust himself. which means if a weapon was introduced specifically for him, it wasn't his. It belonged to someone else. Someone with access. Someone with reach. As word spread that the weapon hadn't been found, tension inside the facility increased. Not panic, concern, because an unfound weapon means unresolved risk. Guards don't like that. Administrators like it even less. An unfound weapon means vulnerability. It means there's something inside the walls that shouldn't be, and that threatens control. Searches intensified. Cells were flipped. Mattresses cut. Lockers emptied. Still nothing. Inmates complained. Tempers flared. But even under pressure, nothing surfaced. Which tells us something else. Whoever removed the weapon did so efficiently. No hesitation. No confusion. They knew exactly where it needed to go, and exactly how to avoid detection. That level of confidence suggests familiarity, not desperation. Another detail complicates things further. According to forensic analysis, the injuries suggested consistency, not randomness. That matters, because improvised attacks tend to be chaotic. This wasn't, which implies the person wielding the weapon had control. Control over the tool. Control over the moment. And control suggests preparation. Investigators quietly began mapping movement patterns. Who was near the corridor before and after the incident? Who changed routes? Who left the area quickly? Patterns emerged. Nothing definitive, but patterns don't need to be definitive to be concerning. One inmate stood out, not because they were seen with anything, but because their movements aligned too perfectly with the gap. They entered the area shortly before. They exited shortly after. No reason given. No explanation required. On paper, it meant nothing. In reality, it meant everything. When questioned, this inmate denied involvement. Calmly, consistently. No cracks. No contradictions. Which is either innocence or preparation. The problem? Without a weapon, there was no physical link. No DNA. No residue. Just circumstantial proximity. And circumstantial cases inside prisons are notoriously difficult, because witnesses don't talk. Not without incentive. And incentives create new problems. As days turned into weeks, the investigation stalled. The missing weapon became a symbol of failure, of uncertainty, of something unresolved. Every time officials tried to close the case, it resurfaced. Because homicide without a weapon leaves a narrative gap. And narrative gaps invite speculation. Inside the facility, rumors evolved. Some claimed the weapon had been flushed. Others said it was passed out through laundry. A few whispered something more disturbing, that it never stayed inside at all, that it left the same way it entered. That possibility rattled people. Because if true, it meant the system hadn't just failed internally. It had been bypassed. Administrators dismissed the idea publicly. Privately, they ordered reviews. Mail logs. Laundry procedures. Waste disposal. Everything was examined. Nothing definitive emerged, which only deepened suspicion. Here's another contradiction. The more thorough the searches became, the clearer it was that the weapon was gone. Not hidden. Gone. That suggests planning beyond the moment. Beyond panic. Beyond improvisation. It suggests someone thought through the aftermath before the act. And thinking through aftermath is rare in spontaneous violence. It's common in deliberate acts. As oversight bodies asked questions, the narrative shifted again. Focus moved away from the weapon and toward accountability. Who was responsible for preventing this? Who failed? That shift matters. Because when attention moves from what happened to who failed, it signals a desire to contain blame. Blame can be distributed. Responsibility can be diluted. But intent cannot. And intent becomes harder to ignore when evidence disappears. One internal memo reportedly used cautious language. Absence of recovered instrument limits investigative conclusions. Translation: we can't prove who did this. And without proof, closure becomes optional. Families demand answers. Systems provide explanations. They are not the same thing. As weeks passed, pressure mounted from outside. Questions from oversight committees, media inquiries, requests for updates. Each one reopened the wound, and each one forced administrators to repeat the same line. Investigation ongoing. But ongoing investigations without progress become performances. They exist to show effort, not to produce results. The missing weapon ensured that, because without it, everything remained speculative. Speculation is safe. Speculation doesn't assign blame. It just floats. Inside the facility, One guard reportedly made a remark that didn't sit right. They said, "Whoever did it knew what they were doing." That statement is telling because it acknowledges skill, and skill implies experience. Experience implies history, which raises the next question. Was this the first time something like this happened, or just the first time it resulted in death? Records show previous incidents in blind spots. Not fatal, but violent, handled quietly, resolved administratively. Patterns again. Patterns that don't prove anything individually.